aircraft commander during combat flight training at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas. We were transferred out to the Strategic Air Command, and it was based in California.
Okay. And is that where you served during the duration of your time in the military?
No, we served partly there and partly in Maine at Dow Air Force Base.
Which is in Bangor, if I'm
That's right.
remembering correctly.
It's no longer a military base.
But I do know it's the longest runway on the East Coast, from what I've been told. Because
I remember the only aircraft accident I have ever directly witnessed in person was at Dow, and it was one of our KC-97s. You have a picture of that, by the way,
right.
The KC-97. Crashed on landing as we were driving out to our afternoon operations meeting.
Right.
We watched this aircraft come in, and over the end of the runway, it suddenly sank onto the runway, tearing off the main gear, left wing, and so on. Fortunately, there were no super serious injuries, and everyone escaped the aircraft.
Well, that's good to hear. When you were you enlisted, or did you
No, I enlisted. I don't know if I'm unique by any means, but I pride myself on my minor accomplishments, notwithstanding the fact that I'm both a high school and a college dropout.
Okay.
So I was very bored with high school, and I browbeat my mother into signing a release that permitted me to go in the Air Force essentially on my 17th birthday.
Right. Where were you living when you
New York City.
Okay. So you born and raised in New York City? Or?
Yes, I'm one of the rarer ones, actually. Well, I must say, I was born in New York City, and those early years were in New York City. But there was a period of 5 years in which I was at a residential school for children in Vermont.
Oh, in St. Johnsbury?
Not in St. Johnsbury, in Westminster, Vermont. And today I'm a trustee, chairman of the executive committee of the Board of Trustees of that school.
Wow.
So it's a bit of payback. They get rid of my New York accent, and so I owe them something.
So, when you enlisted, I'm sure were you able to pick the branch of service you went into?
Yes, absolutely. The Air Force was exciting.
And where did you go through basic training?
At Sampson Air Force Base in northern New York State.
And what was that like?
It was cold. It was the winter time,
Right.
and there was a lot of snow. But physically, it wasn't very demanding. The Air Force, in that respect, wasn't. Not that you didn't have to stay in shape,
Right.
but basic training in the Air Force at that time was primarily classroom. And it really was not much more than an advanced high school in many respects.
Right. So how did they decide, once you were in basic training, what direction you would go in based upon testing, or?
Exactly. They did aptitude testing,
Right.
and then in the end decided where they needed people the most. No, there was some ability to select a branch of service based on your aptitude scores. I chose aerial gunnery because I thought it was exciting, and I was 17 and didn't know any better.
So once you'd gone through all of the basic training and decided what direction you were going to go in, where did you go from there?
The Air Force shipped us out to, and that was interesting. That was my first passenger flight, or I should say flight on a passenger plane, a commercial plane, out to Denver, Colorado, to Lowry Air Force Base, which at that time was their primary gunnery school. It also was the site of the new Air Force Academy. They started the Air Force Academy while they were building Colorado Springs. They needed a place, and they commenced the activities there.
And what did you do once you were at gunnery school?
At gunnery school, for 6 months, it was all very intense technical training, both classroom and hands-on. And then they moved you on, and that was called turret gunner or something. I forget the exact nomenclature. But then you moved on to an actual gunnery school where you were doing your gunnery training in flying. And they were using B-29s left over from World War II.
Right.
And they were stripped. By that I mean they had everything removed except the armament.
Right.
And we would fly our training missions. And those were interesting because they used gun camera film. And in that era, they used F-51 Mustangs to attack the B-29s.
Okay.
And when you returned from one of these training missions, they evaluated your gun camera film and gave you scores. And I began to have doubts about being an area gunner later on, as the aircraft got faster and faster, and the scores got lower and lower.
So that's interesting. I never realized that's how they did.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. One particular thing that was interesting for me, but may not be for this, I drew the short straw on the very first flight. This was routine, because nobody wanted to fly the tail gun position.
Right.
It was a separate unit, separately I'm trying to think of the term, pressurized. It was pressurized separately from the rest of the aircraft. It could actually become depressurized without the rest of the aircraft even knowing about it, yeah. And you had to crawl back there, and I'm fairly tall, so I was 6'2.5" then, probably I'm 6'2" now. And it was difficult to get into the seat, a spring-loaded seat and so on. And then you suddenly look out, this is the first time you've ever been back there in the air, and it looks like you're hanging out over the universe. And then one of these fighters comes rolling in on you, and you're very nervous. But it was interesting.
Right.
Well worthwhile.
I meant to ask up front, and I failed to do so, so I want to remember to do it. How many years were you in the Air Force?
4 years.
From?
Basically January of, perhaps it was early February. I don't remember very well. January of 52 to the same period in 56.
Okay. I usually ask that up front, and I completely forgot, so I didn't want to fail to do so. So you're at gunnery school for how long?
About a year.
Okay.
It's a long training period,
This
both
is
technical and at Lowry. And then we were shipped to Randolph Air Force Base. Those of us who would go on B-29s who were flying in Korea at that time and crewed up. And then flew combat training missions in the B-29s. I happen to be lucky. If you look on that pink card, I think you saw with the crew names on it, that Lieutenant Colonel was the only regular Air Force member of our crew. All the others were reserve guys, other than the enlisted men. The reserve guys called back from World War II. They had to, they had to retrain on aircraft that some of them had flown on. Our co-pilot, for example, was a young second lieutenant, barely out of multi-engine school. But we had this very experienced aircraft commander, this lieutenant colonel. But then two things happened. He came down with bad feet, which wasn't bad because we could hang around the pool for several months, enjoying ourselves and not having to go to Korea. And then he was promoted to full colonel, and full colonels don't crew aircraft. So they broke up the crew and sent us to the Strategic Air Command, some of us. I don't know where everyone went, but we were sent to Castle Air Force Base in California, in the San Joaquin Valley, where we were retrained on B-50 bombers, and that's one of the aircraft you photographed. Yeah.
Right.
No, actually the smaller, the one without the boom.
Okay. Well, that's true. They're not both the same scale.
No.
So.
Yeah, they are.
Are they really?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Believe it or not, the one with the boom on it is merely a double-deck version, in a sense, of the other one, which is why it looks so much larger.
Right.
Same engines, same wingspan, same length, same everything else.
I think it was because of the physical
Yes,
size
yeah,
of the
it
body
does.
of the
It does. It does look larger.
Right. So, describe what an average day was like once you were stationed there. Maybe not every day was the same, but I'm just trying to.
You mean in California?
Yes.
A typical day. I'm trying to remember. There were always training classes. They never seemed to end. Mm-hmm. In fact, we were even sent away, for example, to other bases for training in some specialty or specific area. I would say, all in all, it was pretty boring. Between the classes and flying, you had to fly a lot. And flying, people tend to think of as going out, getting on an airplane, which is what they're accustomed to doing on a commercial plane.
Right.
But no, the day before, we had to pre-flight the aircraft. And we spent hours doing that. If it was going to be a live ammunition mission, you had to load the guns,
right,
which were all 50 calibers on the B-50. There were often activities involving, for example, maintenance of the gun sights and turrets to be certain that you didn't shoot your own vertical stabilizer off. There was a lot of that activity. There was even practice loading nuclear weapons, atomic bombs. That was quite interesting because on a B-50, the type of bombs we loaded required that we jack up the nose of the aircraft. It wouldn't, the carrier and the bomb would not fit into the bomb bay.
When it was in a
Yeah, it had to be jacked up this way.
Wow.
Which is quite interesting. You can imagine, because being an 18-year-old kid at this point, this is all very exciting, Buck Rogers-ish type stuff. But it was great fun, and it was enjoyable, and you felt useful. Those planes were intended for ultimately to attack the Soviet Union if we were ever attacked. So.
Right. Now, in the situation where you were using live ammo
Yes.
on training runs, was it done over a specific area?
Yeah, it was done over gunnery ranges,
Okay.
where the area is completely cleared for miles and miles and miles.
Right.
One of the stories I missed is during combat crew training, our bombardier had bragged about how he had been the champion of the 20th Air Force or some damn thing in World War II. And we thought it was typical bragging. And he also had to participate in gun cleaning because he fired the forward turret on some occasions. And we went out on one of these live ammo bomb dropping. It was very interesting because we took these, they were really 100-pound, 200-pound training bombs with black powder charges. And here was this fellow who said he was so great with his pliers trimming the bomb, the tabs on the bomb and aligning them and so on and so forth. And I want that one and those shackles, I want that one and that, and so on and so forth. And we just thought he was in for a big surprise. Anyway, we were in a place called, I don't remember now. I think it was Amagordo or something like that. Anyway, it's a bombing range with a large target set up right on the edge of I'm suddenly Mexico. What am I thinking of?
Well, Alamogordo's New Mexico, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I'm not sure that wasn't the one. Anyway, it's not important. Memory, boy, it's a lot of years ago. It was toward twilight, and we made the bombing run, and the gunners called the bomb away, because we made 2 runs that day,
Right.
a bomb at a time, and he hit this thing from 20,000 feet, a dead bullseye.
So he
And
wasn't just
we
bragging.
didn't have to clean guns anymore. We would to clean guns. But he was as good. The guy turned out to be as good as he said he was.
That is
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't even fathom being able to do it from that far up, but
Well, he was using what was essentially a World War II bomb site, the Norden bomb site,
right.
except he was good at it. Well, they were all pretty good at it. And this was a modern version of it, of course. It was the state-of-the-art technology for that time, so it was. But in the case of California, I became a mail clerk there, which was very good. Yes, I volunteered to be there. I suddenly heard they needed a mail clerk, and I hung around. I don't know why or how some of these things go about. Maybe perhaps it's instinct. Hung around the orderly room a lot.
Right.
Got to know the adjutant, and had a friend who was the payroll clerk. And I heard, he told me about this mail clerk thing, and I immediately volunteered, and they thought that was a great idea. They knew me. I was always hanging around the orderly room.
Right.
And they let me have it with the Jeep. And so I did that during the rest of the time I was there.
And what did that?
That entailed going up and picking up the mail a couple of days,
Right.
sorting it, and opening the mail room a couple of times a day.
And you were doing this for the whole base?
No, just for my squadron.
Okay.
Okay, we had that's I've jumped ahead a little bit. I should explain. The B-50s, we were initially, when I went to California, we were in the 329th Bombardment Squadron, which was the B-50, the bomber squadron. Those planes were ultimately replaced by the B-47 jets.
Okay.
People who had 2 years or more left in their service were transferred to the air refueling squadrons. And that's where I became the mail clerk, because they had an oversupply of boom operator trainees from all these gunners that came over,
Right.
and they couldn't utilize them all, even though we had 25 aircraft, 25 of those big ones. We couldn't utilize all those people. They had to be trained, people had to be discharged, people left, were transferred, and so on. Eventually, these guys were absorbed. But in the meantime, in addition to your training classes and so on and so forth, you needed something to do. So for me, that was perfect to be the mail clerk. It gave you great power, by the way. Tremendous power, yeah, which I enjoyed.
Now, at this point in time, you were talking about the boom operator. Were they doing the in-flight refueling?
That's exactly what we were doing.
That's what
yeah,
I was,
yeah. Oh, yeah. It's very interesting. Very interesting, especially in bad weather and at night, things like that. One of the things I failed to mention is, because now as mail clerk and because my friend was the payroll clerk,
Right.
I used to sit with him. He worked very hard, and he didn't work just 8 hours, and he was often working into the evenings. And I would sit with him to keep him company. And I used to go through the records, payroll records, to see what he did, to truly understand it. And over a period of time, I began to understand that basically a payroll clerk in a squadron really uses standard forms, standard formats.
Right.
And the names change and their serial numbers change. But there are different types: advanced travel pay, back flight pay, so on and so forth. There are a myriad of these things. And I learned the essentials of being a payroll clerk just by sitting with this guy. Along came a requirement that we had to go to North Africa for 90 days. One of the things that the Strategic Air Command did was to have the capability to move a squadron, squadrons, a wing, or anything, to move them somewhere for 90 days temporary duty and be fully manned in every respect, to have their own food service people, their own medics, their own engine buildup people, their own air police, their combat air police, and all the rest of that. So this became a major undertaking, since we were the prime mover in this, the air refueling squadron. I told the adjutant, and he was very upset because this payroll clerk was about to be discharged. He had no one to take over, and I volunteered. And he said, how can you do that? I mean, you're not trained. I said, I can do it. All I need is clerk typists, because I couldn't type. Right. I need clerk typists. And he said, well, okay. And I gathered up for the payroll records from all these various squadrons, air police, cooks, right, engine people, whatever, and got them all together. And we all flew off to Africa in our planes, put the air police in the lower hull of those things, because they were very unpopular, so they got to ride in the lower part of the aircraft. And we flew off to Africa for 90 days.
They think they're the most important.
Yeah, right. They were wrong. But you saw some of the English pamphlets. That was because we were flying up from North Africa up to England.
Okay.
That's why those were in that box.
Now, where in Africa did they have you?
Sidi Slimane in Morocco.
Okay.
It was an interesting place because it was a combined French-U.S. Air Force base. So it was really quite interesting. That's where I had my first bottle of champagne. Wow. The next day I had my first hangover that I remember to this day, and I'm adverse to champagne. I cannot, I have an almost physical aversion to it. It's really incredible, just from that experience. Well, if you drink 2 bottles, we were in the French military club, the NCO club. Right. I drank 2 bottles at $1 a bottle. And because I thought it was like, it tasted good at the time. Right. I thought it was like Coca-Cola or something.
French champagne at $1 a bottle, too bad you didn't have
Oh, God, yeah, well, it was remember, it was 1953 or 4 or whatever it was. And the next day, because we lived in butler huts. Right. I don't know if you know what those are.
Yes,
okay.
I'm familiar with them.
Butler huts, and it was hot, and it was 120 degrees, and it was horrible. I was hoping a scorpion would bite me and kill me, because I'd never had a head like that in my life. And since, and I've only been drunk perhaps 4 or 5 times in my entire life.
Well, they say you usually remember the first time that happens.
Oh, yeah. So that's what we were doing in Africa, and it was kind of scary there because although we had a long runway, the aircraft were heavy, and taking off in that heat was very dangerous. And you would see the aircraft lift off and then disappear, and then come up the other side. Yeah, because there were, I don't know, sand dunes or whatever. Yeah, it was really scary. Then it was your turn.
Well, you weren't in the tail end by this time, right?
No, I was on a tanker now. I was on an in-flight refueling operator by that time.
You're in the back and you're watching the horizon get above you.
No, but it's really interesting. I've had a B-47 pilot, an older man. He was a colonel, actually. When you do your first hookups, you always have a junior boom operator and a very experienced pilot in the receiver plane. You don't let 2 idiots do it at the same time. They don't allow that. And I remember, I didn't realize it at the time, but I actually had a problem with my depth perception, which was picked up in I saw some documents in there. It was picked up in a physical, but anyway, I put the boom out and hit this B-47 pretty hard. In the proper place, mind you, but hard. And that Southwest drawl, I can remember, take it easy, son, take it easy. But it was more interesting because of the the differential in the performance of the two aircraft. You had a KC-97 heavily laden with fuel. You've got a B-47 that's empty. And this guy's trying to slow down behind you, and he's got his flaps down, his gear down, and the only way you could refuel him is in a shallow dive, a descent, so that the KC-97 could keep up enough airspeed. As the weight shifted, then it became easier, because as you got the fuel in him, he became heavier, and he could pull his gear up and his flaps up, and you could level up.
The trial and error that went into figuring that out.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah. There's some fascinating stories that probably are about what can happen during these incidents. There was a wonderful, I say wonderful, I found it fascinating. There was a monthly Strategic Air Command accident report publication. And some of the things were almost beyond bizarre that would happen with these military planes. For example, I'll give you an example. There was a B-50 taken off from, I forget where it was, in Montana, Wyoming. It's not important because it didn't matter where it took off. What happened was the life rafts, which are in compartments very much like on a commercial plane, above the main wings, came out. One of them broke loose and actually came out and inflated while this aircraft was climbing out. And it flew back and wrapped itself around the horizontal stabilizer. And now this guy was having a horrid time keeping his aircraft in the air. This is why you couldn't make this up. One of the airmen, one of the gunners, or the radio, I don't recall which, it was one of the crewmen, they held on to him, he had his parachute on, and held him out the rear main entrance door. We call it that, even though it's only that big, but that was the rear main entrance door. They held him out, and he took one of our crash axes that we had all over the planes, to cut your way out of the plane and accident. That was the idea, anyway. And he flung this thing at the at this life raft, and it hit it and deflated it.
Right.
In this airplane, although now actually its engines were all screwed up. It's amazing that could happen. Was able to get back and land okay, and everyone was all right.
You missed the raft and hit the stabilizer.
No. Well, that was something we were always very careful of when we did our turret alignments, our gun sight and turret alignments. We were always very careful because you didn't want to.
Now, was there always, once you were in the Strategic Air Command, was there always a chance you could be sent over to Korea, or were they? That
was very unlikely because we were that backup defense against the USSR.
Okay.
The B-47s came, then the B-52s, and they all came to Castle Air Force Base. Interestingly enough.
Was there any concern at the time with the involvement of the Chinese in the war that there was potential of them?
They had entered the war.
But I'm just saying, was there always a concern that they may try to attack?
No, there was never. The focus was always on. We always practiced for the USSR. Always for the USSR. They. One of the reasons I believe is because China didn't have a strategic air capability.
Okay.
They didn't have, in those days, intercontinental ballistics missiles. They didn't have long-range bombers.
That's what I meant to ask.
Yeah, they weren't seen as that kind of a risk. They were perceived, obviously, as a local, regional risk.
Right. As
it turned out. Yeah, as it turned out. Yeah.
Now, you said you were in California for quite some time, or?
Yeah, for about 18 months.
Okay.
And then. We were transferred from the 5th Force, you made a photograph, to the 8th Air Force at Dow Air Force Base in Maine. And I did my last 6 months there. As soon as I was old enough, which was about the time I arrived on the base, I was 20 and a half, the minimum age to apply for OCS in that era.
Right.
Although I think in World War II there were 25-year-old full colonels flying fighter planes, but certainly by that time that was not going on. And I took the test and I passed. And as I mentioned,
Right.
with what I'm told
scored
was the
very
highest
well.
score ever attained on the OCS test at Dow, which it may not be. If it had been some of the bigger bases, that might have been more significant. That's not really much of a base. In any event, my 4 years came up, and I had a tentative acceptance. This means that you qualify, you're on their waiting list, and so on. But I didn't trust them when they said that, I simply didn't believe them when they said they wanted me to stay until the July class, that I would definitely be assigned to the July class. This again was February, or something of '56. And so I got out. Well, that was fine. I went to my wife's home. I had no place to go. I won't go into the personal reasons, but I went to my wife's, present wife's home. She's a cousin. That might explain a lot. I went to her uncle. Yeah. And within a month, I received the permanent appointment, and it is in there.
Right.
It is in there. You may have seen it.
Yes.
And I intended to go, and I accepted, but I didn't have any money. And so I knew someone at Johnson Controls, and they got me under what I must admit were false pretenses, a job, so I could earn money for 6 months or whatever it was until I was to report to Lackland Air Force Base down in San Antonio for the school. But as the months passed, I liked the freedom, and I decided that no, I'd rather stay with Johnson. And so 39 years later, I retired from Johnson as a corporate vice president, in charge of the International Controls Division. So
Wow, that's quite a journey.
well, yeah, but it's not untypical, I think, of what some people did in those days, because I came out and I realized I was reasonably intelligent. I had that going, if not formally educated. All right, and I understood very quickly that without an education, the future was dim. So I started working. I stayed at Johnson, working and going to school at night at Pace University in the city. Yeah, in New York City, down in front of City Hall.
I know they're in Pleasantville
Yeah.
as well.
Well, now
Right.
it's
Right.
and I went and I was carrying, and this is amazing actually, I was carrying 12 credits at night a semester,
And working
and
full-time.
working full time, and 8 credits in the summer, and it was a bugger. Actually, my grades weren't that bad.
Well, what were you studying when you went back?
Finance,
Okay.
accounting. And I did that for 3 years or whatever it was. And I came up with some ideas in the company, and they liked them. And so they transferred us to Milwaukee, to the headquarters. And then the University of Wisconsin looked at my transcript and said, you can't have 20 credits of finance and 6 credits of financial statement analysis and all this sort of thing. He said, you're going to have ecology and political science and all that. So they stripped out about 25 credits out of this thing. And they were all the financial, the major, the things that ultimately made me a living.
Right.
And I had a letter, at one point the company, which was rather amusing, my wife remembers this very well. The company sent me to Purdue for a month for a course, a computer course actually. That was one of the things that got us transferred out there. They noticed that I had taken computer courses at Pace. They're actually run by IBM, but nevertheless they were part of the Pace curriculum. And they sent me to Purdue, and that was some more computer courses. And when I got back, I'd missed a lot of classes at the University of Wisconsin. And they sent me a letter saying, we're dropping you, and when you think you're mature enough to know what you want to do in the future. And I swear to God, this is true. I kept it in my top drawer. And when my withholding tax was more than that guy who signed that letter was ever going to make in a lifetime, right, then I didn't need the letter anymore. So, so in any event, it's kind of funny. My career with Johnson Controls was steady. I always followed the philosophy of doing what the company wanted me to do, because there was always a need.
Right.
At one point they asked me. At one point I thought I was going to get fired because the treasurer of this company was a friend of mine, but in a statement to the then CEO, said, "We have to find something for Ron Williams to do. He's getting bored." And the CEO pounded the table and he said, "Johnson Controls is not here for the amusement of Ron Williams," which is true. I said, "Oh, thanks a lot. I really appreciate that." Actually, he liked me. The CEO liked me. But in any event, they sent us. They asked me if we wanted to go to Canada.
Right.
And that sounded exciting because it wasn't the United States. It was something different. And I said, "Yeah." And that was on a Monday, and on a Wednesday they asked me, "Would you like to go to Italy?" That sounded even more exciting. So we went off to Italy, and that was our first tour in Italy. And we were there for 7 years.
Wow.
7 years.
So you must have learned the language, I take it.
Oh, I speak it fluently. And we came back for 5, and then they sent us back. They asked us, they practically begged us to go back.
Now, where exactly were you?
Well, we lived on Lake Como.
Wow.
My office was in Milano, and I had a factory near Monza. Monza, you remember, for the racetrack.
Right.
Yeah. So that was quite interesting. Oh yeah, it was good. It was good duty.
So
it was interesting.
What finally brought you to Connecticut? Was it with Johnson?
I retired.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I retired. But we were. Let me just finish the overseas assignment.
It's a nice location, I might say.
Yeah, thank you. We were back for 5 years after that first assignment of 7, and then they sent us back, and it was 5 years, and I had just been made European Managing Director, right, and I was back in Milwaukee picking up my crown and scepter, and. And after 4 days of this, they said, "Be in the chairman's office tomorrow morning," right, at 7:30. And I thought, "Oh, shit, what's up?" Something's up. So then they said, "Well, we want you to take a group over and evaluate this company that IT&T is trying to sell. And it looks like it fits something we would be interested in. Take a group. Who do you want to go?" And I picked a bunch of guys that I knew. And we went over and we decided we should buy it. They came over and I said, "Yeah, we'll buy. We should buy this thing." And to make a long story short, they said, "Fine, but you've got to run it." So it doubled our European operation. It was so big that it was twice our total European operation. So forget Brussels. Now you have to go because the board is going to be watching this, and we want you to go run it. And since you're going to do the board presentation, in any event, so we went from Italy to Germany for 3 years, and we made a big success out of it. Out of a very bad money-losing company, we turned it around in record time.
For a fair number of years, then.
15 years. 15.
Were you pining for the United States at all while you were there?
Not really, not really in that sense. As long as our children were with us, when the children left to go back, which was college, right, then our interest in Europe waned because we wanted to be where the kids were. So, and the timing was good in that respect, because as we succeeded in whatever we were doing, the company then would find something more demanding at a higher level for you to do. And that's what happened. So after 3 years in Germany, in fact, we were sitting in Kuwait when the CEO told me, we're going to make some changes back there and we need you to come back. So That's how we got back to Milwaukee. And then I was there from 1985 until 1995. And then I retired after 39 years. Somewhere along the line, I became a corporate vice president. I was a divisional or group vice president, but eventually a corporate vice president in charge of worldwide control business. Johnson Controls will do, is forecast to do around $31 billion this year. So
Yeah, they're a very large company.
it's a big company, yeah. Interesting fields too, very, very interesting.
Well, and considering you were the kid in New York who dropped out of school to join the
Oh yeah, and
Air
dropped out of
Force,
college. College and high school
Right.
dropout. Yeah, I liked it.
That's quite
So-
a story.
Well,
You rarely hear anything like that anymore, though.
not very much, and it makes you feel funny in a way when you sit and you're looking at master's degrees and even an occasional PhD, and you're saying, gee, he's got a great education because Zippo experience.
Right.
One of the biggest problems we had, I found with young people coming with good educations was we used to get a lot of applications from the Thunderbird School of International Management, University of Arizona. Well, these guys had good educations, but knew nothing of the business, absolutely nothing. And we operated in a very complex engineering-oriented environment. And you try to encourage them, say, I could give you a job, but I have to put you in a domestic branch office for a year or two, and you learn the business. Then we can move you to international. And none of them wanted to do that. They wanted to start off as an international vice president. So that was not not very encouraging. But when you're a college dropout and you're sending some guy with a master's degree away with his tail between his legs, it does make you feel a little funny.
Right.
Well, we all know there are many ways to get an education. The documents merely suggest that you got it in a scholastic environment,
Right.
but obviously an experience can provide a wonderful education as well. So.
Now, do you feel the 4 years you spent in the Air Force helped you a lot?
Oh, they were invaluable for me because they taught me discipline. I was very undisciplined. I was smart.
Right.
There was no question about that. I knew, and I don't mean that as an ego statement. I could learn very quickly. In fact, one of the things that always amazed them in the company was my ability to pick things up, to learn engineering terminology and so on. Engineers didn't talk down to me. They talked as if I actually understood. And I sounded like I understood, but very often I didn't. But it really didn't matter. It's part of, part of the, but I also, I actually sat, when I was overseas, I had a lot of time in Italy, for example, and I would just read technical bulletins. I just read and read and read. And there was one of my colleagues who later on I had to send in a retirement because he didn't want a cushy job in Toronto for a couple of years, didn't want to make multiple moves,
Right.
and decided to retire. He taught me the business, the basic business. I would go into his office and I would say, John, what's a normally open valve? And he'd put everything aside very quietly and get out one of these drawing things, and he would draw me this and explain it. And I'd go away and I'd ponder that for 24 hours and come in the next day, John, what's a normally open valve? And he would draw that.
Or you had normally open one side, normally closed
On the other side,
solenoid in the middle.
I told you that that's so ingrained. You saw the notebooks,
Right.
all the technical training, and you had to, of course, pass exams with that. But one of the things I can still say to this day, and it had to do with the gun sight on the B-50 bomber. And it was called, actually, it was part of that system. It was called the Amphidyne. And the Amphidyne amplifies, rectifies, has a bidirectional output, and acts as an electronic switch between the 1 and 31 speed cell sensors. That's right out of, it's right out of one of the exams.
Well, something tells me if you didn't memorize that, it could be a bad situation.
Actually, I'm not going to show it to you, but I have in the basement, I have a gun sight off a B-50. I had this idea that I was going to take this thing and, clean it up and chrome it up, and it would be a thing. And after removing some of it, the hell with it. I don't want to do that anymore.
Did you or do you still keep in touch with anyone that you served with when you were in the Air Force?
Only one person, and he's in Montana. And I lost track of him for years. And I tracked him down ultimately on internet searches. And it turned out that the guy did not do, I expected to find him as a physics professor at a university. So I searched Western universities, I could find nothing. I don't recall actually how I did find him, but I did call from this house, and when I found a phone number somehow in Montana, and it turned out that his career was entirely different. He went to Honeywell as a software engineer. He had a master's degree and an extremely smart guy, studied constantly, drove me nuts. Ultimately left them, set up his own business, went bankrupt, ended back in Montana, in Helena, where he was from.
Right.
And I think I found him, actually. I just went, I looked in the Helena phone book, and there he was.
Wow. So you keep in touch now?
Oh, yeah.
So that's nice.
Yeah, he was my best friend in the Air Force, so I suppose it's not so unusual, but there was this long gap when I was, and I often wonder what happened to so many of those people. Some of them are in the pictures there.
Well,
they were my colleagues.
An interesting sideline is in talking to vets and also listening to some of the interviews. That's not uncommon for them to be very close.
Yeah.
In the service and then grow apart. And I think about the only time you ever do see a lot of activity is if they're doing the reunions every year, and you see
yes.
that, mostly you see that with the Navy, with the ships.
Yeah.
Probably because they were in close quarters for so long. But it's always interesting to hear about when people do connect.
Well, it's even with the company. People I was very close to for years and years and years. Probably there are three on my email list. One was an MBA. He was one of my staff that I've always stayed in contact with. He did a lot of good work for me. Another was my boss. Final boss. He was an executive vice president. He was a corporate vice president, as I, but he was a level up. And then there is one of the members of the board of directors of Johnson Controls, and he's been a buddy for years. We both speak Italian, so he likes to send me notes in Italian, that sort of thing. But I really love the Air Force. I really, really did. And had that OCS appointment come through a month before rather than a month after my 4 years were up, I would have retired from the Air Force, assuming I wasn't killed in Vietnam.
Right.
It wasn't as simple as I didn't want to go because I liked it outside. No, I thought through the process. You have to remember that the Air Force Academy was turning out its first graduates. I would be going back as a non-rated officer, non-flying officer, non-academy officer. I would have been competing with that level of competition, and I'm not certain. And so I didn't have any doubts about my ability, but it was one more factor. If you really liked being out and you were going to face even stiffer competition when you go back in, why bother? As it turned out very well for me, but I've often asked myself, what would have happened if I'd gone back in? I don't know, I might be a general today. I might be dead in Vietnam. That was the part that I keep thinking of. Yeah, I know what would have happened. I would have ended up in an administrative function, or I would have ended up in as a gunnery officer in a B-52 wing, something like that. And
So, jumping ahead to when you retired.
yes.
What made you choose Connecticut? What made you choose this area
Well,
of Connecticut?
we have one son who lives in Greenwich
Okay.
with his family, and one son that lives in New York City, his family. And we left a daughter in Milwaukee, but by some miracle, and I say miracle because the chances of winning the lottery are probably greater. A company headhunted her husband here and brought them east, and they chose to live in Madison, where they remain to this day. And so we're perfectly located. No, even better than one could have ever planned. And at the time, although we've been here now since 1995, keep in mind that the kids were much smaller and so on, and we didn't want to be too close. Wanted to be close enough for visits, but not close enough to be the permanent babysitters or any of that stuff, which I wouldn't have done anyway, but that's, my wife would, you know. So that's really why we ended up here. We're extremely happy here. We like our house. We're, you know, decent and comfortable. It's a little big for two people, but
Well, I have a familial affinity to the town too, so.
yeah, well, yeah, sure. You grew up here, really?
No, actually I grew up in Westchester County, New York.
Down in.
I lived here for a short while from 2001 to 2003, and I'm up in Glastonbury now.
Well, Pat's from Rye, and well, I lived there because I lived at her house. I can remember sitting with that letter that you saw in there from the OCS thing, sitting on the steps in her house, and she asking me, "Are you going?" She was sitting next to me reading the letter. "Are you going?" There was nothing romantic that existed between these two people. We were cousins. We are cousins. And I said, yes, I'm going, because this is what I dreamed of. You know, this is what I want to be. I want to go and be an Air Force officer, and be a general or a field marshal or something. But and so that was determined. I was going.
Right.
But then the months passed.
Well, it certainly is an interesting.
It's a bit unusual. It's a bit irregular in terms of sort of career and so on, but not extraordinary. I mean, there are much more interesting stories, I'm sure, that you've heard.
Well, everyone has its unique perspective, and that's what makes this whole project very interesting and very fulfilling.
You see, when I attended this private school in Vermont, we have, in fact, our children have done it the same way, really. You're brought up to understand that you behave yourself, you go to high school, you get good grades, you go to college, you eventually get married, you buy a small house, and you buy a big house. You know, there's this sort of track one goes on if you're a middle-class American. Well, of course, a lot of people don't do that anymore, and they don't want to do it. But we did it. Well, I don't know if what I just described exactly fits that, but pretty close, really. If you step beyond the Air Force, what I did was perfectly normal the rest of the way. But our kids have followed the same pattern. But I don't think their children will, although they may.
Right.
You know, they look around and say, well, this isn't all that bad, you know.
That's usually an incentive.
This is better than being homeless.
Sometimes the work part of it is tough, but there's always the incentive.
Yeah, right. It was when you look at those things, I can tell you there's a flight in there of 15 hours and 45 minutes. There are a bunch of long flights, but there's one in
Is this
particular.
when you were sitting in the tail, or?
No, I was sitting in the central fire control gunners. I was the only time I ever flew in the tail was that one time. The very first time, never again. I was central fire control gunner, and we were flying this long 15 and 45-minute with refueling, because the B-50s refuel.
Right.
And by one of the other aircraft, as it turned out, by a KC-97. And it was awful. It was over Arizona someplace. It was hot, and it was sickening. And I was literally hoping something would go wrong with that aircraft so we could bail out of it. I really, really wanted out of that airplane. It wasn't so bad. I think I may have flown a bit longer when we flew from Dow to Sidi Slimane.
Mm-hmm. Now, were you on oxygen most of the time when you were up there?
No.
So you weren't up
What is interesting is when we were flying out over the coast of California on a routine training mission, not one of these extraordinary long things, there was an incredible I've forgotten the name of it, tailwind, but that's not what I'm.
El Nino or El?
No. What is the prevailing wind that?
The jet stream.
The jet stream. There was an incredible jet stream. Drew a blank. It happens too often these days. Incredible jet stream, and this pilot decided he wanted to see how high we could take a B-50. So the plane in normal flying things, when you're not combat, it's pressurized. Mm-hmm. So we depressurized it because we were going to go as high up as we could, and we put on our oxygen masks. And we got this plane up to, I think it was over 38,000 feet, which is incredible for a propeller-driven plane. I never flew in a jet that high in all the years that followed until one day in one of our corporate jets, right, which we were up at 42,000 feet. But in that old prop-driven plane, we got that. It was porpoising, sucking air. Huh?
He didn't get in trouble for that, did he?
No. We didn't do anything. We didn't do anything
Some of
right.
the World War II pilots said that if it ever was found out that they took the bombers up that high, they were going to get a talking to.
Well, no, I don't recall. I do recall one of our pilots getting into trouble, but that was because there was a tail gunner who I think he may have suffered from narcolepsy.
Right.
And he would fall asleep all the time in the tail thing. And you had to, I think every 30 minutes we would do a round of, I'm okay, you're okay, left gunner, right gunner, center, right, and so on, to make sure everyone's all right, and the tail gunner. Well, he didn't answer. And so they were worried about him, but they knew he fell asleep all the time. So this pilot decided he was going to wake him up and teach him a lesson, and he started swinging the tail back and forth. And it did wake him up, and finally, after he was able to get control of his mic and so on, which had torn loose from the banging, he was able to report in. But when we got back, the aircraft all along the wing route, there was torn metal. It had ripped like someone had taken metal shears, and tore it. Yeah, on one side by the wing route. He got into trouble for that.
Was that the stress from when he was?
Yes, from swinging his plane around. Wow. It isn't where you'd expect to see it. You'd expect to see it in the tail section. This was on the wing route. It was a shocker because you don't know whether it's you're looking at something superficial or something really structural.
Fortunately, they survived it.
Terrible.
Well, I think we've.
You got enough?
We've covered everything with you.
Okay.
And I thank you very much for taking the time to do this.
It's my pleasure. I hope it's.
And having this in your home.
Yeah. What is Tim studying?